Title: The Depths of Atlantis. Chapter 1: The Whisper of the Deep. The rain had been falling for days, a relentless, cold drizzle that seemed to wash the city in a murky fog, blanketing everything in a suffocating grey. Even the air, thick with moisture, felt alive, heavy with secrets that longed to be uncovered. Evelyn Brooks sat at her desk, hunched over her cluttered computer, her fingers trembling slightly as she sifted through the endless sea of digital files. She had been at this for hours, the glow of her screen the only light in the otherwise darkened room. Her office was small, tucked away in the crumbling corner of a building long abandoned by those who had once called it home. It smelled of old paper, forgotten dreams, and the faint, sour aroma of mildew creeping in from the corners of the walls. The place felt like a tomb, and Evelyn had long since stopped noticing the damp air or the oppressive silence that seemed to follow her everywhere. She had other things to focus on now: the files, the encrypted documents that had arrived anonymously in her inbox, like a gift wrapped in dark intention. At first, she had dismissed them as another conspiracy, just another wild story from someone desperate to be heard. But when she saw the name, Project Atlantis, she couldn't turn away. It was a name that had been buried for years, shrouded in mystery, but something about it made her skin crawl. It wasn't just a research project. It wasn't just a government cover-up. No, it was much deeper than that. The more she read, the more Evelyn felt herself being drawn into the unknown, like a moth to an invisible flame. Project Atlantis. The name echoed in her mind, and she couldn't shake the feeling that it was calling her, beckoning her closer. The first few documents she decrypted were vague, filled with technical jargon, unintelligible military lingo, and the kind of corporate doublespeak she had long since grown numb to. But as she dug deeper, patterns began to emerge. There were references to a secretive underwater research facility deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean, a place that had once been operational, but had been abandoned suddenly, its purpose left unclear. Some documents suggested that the facility had been shut down due to a containment breach, though none of the reports could agree on what had been contained, or what had gone wrong. Others mentioned an anomaly, a discovery deep in the trenches of the ocean that had changed everything. But the most chilling part of the files was a series of video clips, blurry, grainy footage showing the interior of the underwater research station. People, scientists, researchers, working in a space that appeared, at first glance, to be completely mundane. But there was something strange in the air, a tension that clung to the frames like a shadow, a feeling that the people on the screen were not entirely in control of their environment. In one clip, a researcher looked over his shoulder as though he could feel someone, or something, watching him. The unease was palpable. The next clip was worse, footage of chaos. Screams, the camera shaking violently, capturing only flashes of movement and distorted shadows before the feed cut out entirely. The last video was the most disturbing. It showed a figure, a silhouette, standing at the far end of a hallway, the only source of light coming from a flickering overhead bulb. The figure didn't move, but it didn't need to. It was the silence around it that struck Evelyn the hardest. A silence that was thick with a terrible unspoken promise. Whoever, or whatever it was waiting. And the air in the video, despite being underwater, seemed to shimmer with something unnatural. The more Evelyn watched, the more her mind rebelled. She didn't know what she was seeing, but her gut told her it wasn't something that should have existed in the world of humans. Her body began to respond, a cold sweat forming on her brow as her thoughts spiraled out of control. She couldn't stop. She couldn't pull herself away. The deeper she went into these files, the more she felt the pull of something she couldn't quite understand. It was as though the ocean, vast and unknowable, was calling to her, whispering in the back of her mind. A knock at the door broke her concentration. Startled, she snapped the laptop shut, the familiar weight of panic settling in her chest. She hadn't expected anyone. "Come in," she called, her voice tight. The door creaked open. Standing in the threshold was Samir Patel, a fellow journalist. His tall frame filled the doorway, his expression a mixture of concern and something darker, something Evelyn couldn't quite place. "I brought you some coffee," Samir said, his voice low, eyes flicking nervously to the desk that was cluttered with papers and the cold, glowing screen of her computer. Evelyn forced a smile, her lips feeling strangely stiff. "Thanks," she said, her tone too sharp. She motioned to the mug he held in his hand. "You've been here before." Samir glanced at the desk again, his gaze lingering on the screen for a moment too long. "Evelyn, you've been at this for days. You've got to stop. Whatever you're doing, it's consuming you." Evelyn's fingers twitched at the mention of the word stop. For a moment she wanted to lash out, wanted to scream at him to leave her be. But instead she pressed her lips together and let the silence stretch between them. She couldn't explain it to him. She didn't have the words. She couldn't tell him about the things she'd seen, the things she felt deep inside her bones, calling to her from the abyss. "I'm fine," she said, too quickly. "I just have to finish this. You wouldn't understand." Samir sighed and sat down across from her. His gaze softened, but there was a flicker of something dark in his eyes, something unspoken. He set the coffee down on the edge of her desk, not bothering to offer it to her. "You don't get it, do you?" he said quietly, his voice strained. "You think this is just another conspiracy, another hidden government project like all the others. But Evelyn, this is different. This isn't some story you can unravel in a weekend. It's not a joke. These people, these researchers, they died, and the people who were behind it, they're still out there, and they don't want you poking around in their secrets." Evelyn's jaw tightened. She was used to people telling her to walk away, journalists, colleagues, even family. But it was different now. She couldn't stop. She couldn't leave this alone. The truth was right there, just out of reach, and she was so close, so very close. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice growing hoarse. "I've seen the files, Samir. I've seen the footage. Whatever's down there, it's not just some research. It's alive. It's waiting." Samir looked at her, his expression darkening. His gaze darted to the screen, then back to her face, his voice softer now. "What do you mean, alive?" Evelyn swallowed hard, her throat dry. She opened her laptop again, her hands shaking slightly as she brought up the documents one more time. She pulled up a photograph, an aerial view of the ocean, dotted with concentric circles, as if something had risen from the depths. A strange marking in the water. Something was out there, something the world wasn't meant to see, something that wasn't supposed to be alive. Samir leaned forward, staring at the image. He was silent for a long time before he finally spoke, his voice low, almost a whisper. "Evelyn, listen to me. Whatever you think you've uncovered, whatever you think you're about to find, it's not going to be what you expect. These people, the researchers, they knew what they were dealing with. They understood what they were poking at. And now, whatever was in that ocean, it's coming for you. It's coming." Her pulse quickened. There was something in his tone now, something far more serious than she'd ever heard before. It wasn't just fear, it was warning. She stared at Samir, her lips trembling. For the first time she felt doubt gnawing at her. "Then it's already too late," she whispered, "because I can feel it. Whatever it is, it's calling to me. And I'm going to answer." Samir recoiled slightly, his eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and concern. "Evelyn, no, you don't know what you're dealing with." But Evelyn didn't hear him. Her mind had already moved beyond him, beyond the confines of the room. The documents were laid out before her like a map to an uncharted territory. And the ocean was waiting, and it would not be denied. This extended version builds upon the foundation set earlier, adding more psychological depth, tension, and a more ominous sense of foreboding as Evelyn dives deeper into her obsession with Project Atlantis. The interaction with Samir adds complexity to the narrative, hinting at the danger of pursuing the mystery further. Chapter 2. The Echo of Atlantis. Extended. The room had begun to feel like a tomb. Evelyn's eyes stung from the constant glare of the computer screen, the only light in the small, cluttered apartment. Her body ached from days of sitting in the same chair, staring at the endless torrent of data that continued to flood her inbox. Files, reports, documents, each one more cryptic than the last. They all circled around the same elusive topic, Project Atlantis. She had no idea what it was, but she knew that it was the key to something far deeper, something ancient and dark. The deeper she dug, the more she felt herself being pulled into a maelstrom of hidden truths and dangerous knowledge. She hadn't seen daylight in days, maybe longer. The world outside her apartment had become a distant memory, a vague blur of noise and fleeting moments. She couldn't escape the truth. The ocean was calling to her, its dark, unfathomable depths, whispering secrets she couldn't yet understand, and she was powerless to resist. She had to keep going, to dive deeper. Her fingers trembled as they moved across the keyboard. She couldn't stop herself. Not now. The latest document she had decrypted was titled, "The Final Report, The Anomaly." She had hesitated before opening it, knowing that this could be the moment where everything changed. What she found was nothing like the reports she had read before. It was fragmented, the text skipping and stuttering in places as if parts of it had been deliberately corrupted. Yet, it was chilling in its implications. The anomalies described were not just environmental, they were biological, and something far worse. Entity discovered. Deep below the facility, not of this earth. The words jumped out at her. She felt the hairs on her neck stand on end, an inexplicable fear surging through her veins. She read the line again. It was there, in plain text. But what did it mean? Not of this earth. What had they found down there? For a moment, the room seemed to close in around her. The air felt thicker, the shadows in the corners of the room deepening, stretching like something alive. Evelyn shook her head, trying to dismiss the thought. But the sensation lingered, that horrible gnawing feeling that something had changed. The whispers from the video files, the distant sounds that she couldn't explain, came back to her. They were there, lurking at the edge of her thoughts. And now, they were louder. A low, murmuring hum in the back of her skull, like the sound of the ocean in the distance, just on the edge of hearing. It was the middle of the night, or what she assumed was night. Time had lost all meaning to her. She glanced at the clock. 3:15 a.m. The numbers seemed to mock her, ticking away the hours that she had lost, hours that could never be reclaimed. She had to finish this. She had to. A sudden knock at the door shattered the silence, startling Evelyn so much that she nearly knocked the laptop off the desk. Her heart skipped a beat, the sound of the knock too loud in the oppressive quiet of her apartment. She froze. Who could that be? She hadn't spoken to anyone in days, not since Samir had visited her last. He had warned her to stop. He had begged her to let it go, but she hadn't listened. She couldn't. And now, with the knock echoing through the apartment, her chest tightened with a rising unease. The knock came again, insistent, like a command. "Evelyn!" came a voice from the other side of the door. A voice she recognized. Samir. Evelyn swallowed hard and slowly stood up from her chair, her legs weak from sitting for so long. She felt a strange reluctance, as if her feet were dragging her toward the door, pulling her away from the computer and the files that had consumed her. Her fingers brushed the doorknob, and for a moment, she hesitated. There was something about this visit, something about Samir's voice, that felt off. It wasn't just concern in his tone. It was fear. She opened the door. Samir stood there, his face pale, his eyes wide with something she couldn't place. He was shaking, as though he had just run a marathon, his clothes disheveled. A deep, dark circle had formed beneath his eyes, as though sleep had long since abandoned him. I couldn't wait anymore, he stammered, glancing nervously over his shoulder, as though expecting someone, or something, to be following him. You have to stop, Evelyn. You have to stop digging. It's not worth it. It's not just a project anymore. What are you talking about? Evelyn's voice was hoarse, thick with exhaustion, but there was a sharp edge to it now, an impatience she didn't recognize. I'm close, Samir. I'm so close. You're not close, he said, his voice breaking. You're in too deep. There's a reason they abandoned that project. You don't know what you're dealing with. It's bigger than you, bigger than any of us. Evelyn shook her head, her fingers tightening on the doorframe. You don't understand. Project Atlantis is real. It's all real. It's all connected. They found something, Samir. Something that shouldn't exist, and it's coming. They had to bury it. but I can feel it. It's here, and I need to know what happened. I have to finish this. Evelyn, he whispered, his voice trembling. You don't understand. I followed you. I've been watching you. He looked down at his feet, unable to meet her eyes. I saw the files. All of them. And it's not just in the files. It's in your head now too. Evelyn's heart began to race. What are you talking about? There's something in the files you haven't seen yet. It's been reaching out to you, Evelyn. I saw it too. I've been hearing things, seeing things in the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to believe it. But you've awakened it. He took a shaky step back, looking as though he might bolt, like a man caught in a trap. Whatever is down there, it's not done yet, and it won't stop until it gets what it wants. Evelyn's chest tightened, a cold knot settling in her stomach. She could feel the room pressing in on her, the walls narrowing, the whispers from the files, the ones she had thought were just her imagination. No, they were real. She could feel them now, just behind her ears, faint but undeniable. Samir's eyes darted nervously toward the hallway behind him, then back to Evelyn. You have to listen to me. We need to get out of here. We need to leave. But Evelyn didn't move. She was frozen, her gaze locked on Samir's frantic face. Her thoughts were tangled, twisting around the words he had just spoken. Had he seen it too? Had the ocean's pull reached him as well? The room seemed to grow colder, the air thickening. The pressure was unbearable, but Evelyn couldn't look away. She couldn't turn back. She had already gone too far. The moment stretched on, a suffocating silence falling between them. Samir looked at her, desperation in his eyes. Please, Evelyn, before it's too late. For the first time in days, Evelyn felt a shiver run down her spine. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a sudden noise filled the room. Something scraping, like nails against glass. It was soft at first, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it seemed to reverberate through the very walls of the apartment. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat, her heart hammering in her chest. She knew what it was. She knew. She had felt it before. The faint vibration in the air, the electric charge that came just before. And then, the lights went out. The dark enveloped them, swallowing up the faint glow of the streetlights outside the window. Evelyn felt a cold, unseen presence pressing in around her, as if the room itself was alive, breathing with a life of its own. Samir grabbed her arm, his grip tight and panicked. What did you do? He hissed. What have you done? Evelyn's head spun, the whispers now deafening, the voices clawing at the edges of her sanity. They were everywhere, inside her skull, in the very air. They were speaking her name. Evelyn. She didn't know if they were coming from the dark corners of the room, from Samir, or from deep within her own mind. But it didn't matter. She had gone too far. This extended portion builds a tense atmosphere, revealing more of the psychological and supernatural forces that are closing in on Evelyn. The chapter introduces a disturbing external force, Samir's warnings, and deepens the mystery surrounding Project Atlantis and the entity that lies at its heart. It sets up the next stage of the story, where the psychological unraveling begins, and the true horror of what Evelyn has uncovered starts to make itself felt. Chapter 3. Beneath the Surface. Extended. The moment Evelyn stepped beyond the threshold of the apartment, a strange and heavy silence enveloped her. The oppressive weight of the darkness pressed in from all sides, as though the very air was thickening around her. She could barely hear the sound of her own breathing, the rhythmic thudding of her heart, which was now erratic and unsteady, as if her body had realized something that her mind had not yet grasped. Samir's voice had faded into the distance behind her, calling her name, but it was distant now, muffled by the walls, as though she were hearing him from underwater. She didn't stop to listen to him anymore. The sounds of his pleas, his warnings, they no longer mattered. Not when the pull was so strong, so undeniable. Her hand rested on the cold brass doorknob, the metal slick with an unnatural chill that crawled up her arm like an ice-cold tendril. For a moment, Evelyn froze, her body locking in place. The apartment felt distant, A distant memory now, an echo that no longer seemed to belong to her. She was no longer in control of her own movements. Something deeper, had taken hold of her. With a deep, shuddering breath, Evelyn turned the knob. The-ching! As the door creaked open, the world beyond was nothing like she had imagined. She had expected the familiar hallway of the building, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper, dim fluorescent lights flickering overhead. She had expected the faint, musty scent of old carpets, the hum of electricity in the background, but what she saw, what she stepped into, was something else. It was vast, far larger than any hallway could ever be. The space stretched before her, cavernous and infinite. The air was thick with the stench of salt, decay, and something ancient. The walls were made of slick, obsidian-like material that seemed to absorb the very light around it, dark and smooth, like the surface of the ocean at midnight. There were no windows, no doors, no signs of life, just a great yawning expanse of nothingness. For a brief moment, Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. The unease that had gripped her body earlier intensified. She wanted to step back, to turn away, but her body refused. She was drawn in, compelled by forces she didn't understand. Her pulse raced in her ears, and yet her feet kept moving forward, as though an invisible hand were guiding her. A distant sound reached her ears, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to resonate in the very marrow of her bones. It was soft at first, barely audible above the rush of her heartbeat, but it grew louder, like the constant drone of the ocean or the rumble of a distant storm. It was familiar, this sound. She had heard it before, in her dreams, in the recordings she had found, buried in the archives of Project Atlantis. The hum of the ocean, the murmur of something ancient, something that had waited for millennia. She continued forward, drawn irresistibly toward the center of the room. Her mind was spinning, her thoughts a disjointed blur. She could feel the weight of the whispers growing stronger now, pressing in on her thoughts. They were no longer distant. They were close, too close. She could almost hear them, each one distinct yet indistinguishable from the others, as if they were all speaking at once from every direction. Evelyn! The voice was familiar, too familiar, though she couldn't place it. It was deep, resonant, like the sound of the ocean's depths. Her heart stuttered in her chest. She stopped walking. The voice had come from somewhere near, but it wasn't from Samir. It was something else. She felt it in her bones, the undeniable certainty that she had stepped into a realm far beyond the one she knew. And then, she saw it. At the far end of the cavernous space stood a massive structure, something so alien, so impossible, that Evelyn could not comprehend its form. It was made of the same black polished stone that adorned the walls, but it was much larger, towering, monolithic, its edges sharp and angular. It resembled a tower, but one that defied every rule of architecture, every principle of geometry. Its base seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy, a low rhythmic thrum that seemed to call to her, beckoning her forward. The symbols etched into its surface, lines, curves, shapes that defied logic, glowed faintly in the darkness, a sickly pulsating light. As Evelyn approached, the air around her grew colder, the temperature dropping with each step. She felt it at the back of her neck, a creeping, crawling sensation that spread through her body like ice water. "Come closer, Evelyn." The voice again. It was clear now, unmistakable. It wasn't human, that much she knew. The words were distorted, echoing off the walls, swirling around her like smoke. It was calling her, and she couldn't ignore it. She couldn't resist it. Her legs moved, as if of their own accord. She was walking now, toward the structure, her eyes fixed on the glowing symbols that seemed to twist and writhe in the darkness. Her heart pounded in her chest, her breathing shallow, but she didn't stop. She couldn't. The closer she got, the stronger the sensation became. The whispers were now all around her, like a chorus of voices, each one speaking a word, a sentence, a command that she couldn't make sense of. They were coming from every direction, from beneath the floor, from above, from the very walls themselves. Evelyn. The words slid into her consciousness like oil, slick and smooth, seeping into her thoughts, her very soul. She felt them, the weight of them pressing against her mind, invading her consciousness. They were no longer voices. They were thoughts, thoughts that weren't her own, thoughts that had always been there, hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be awakened. The structure loomed before her now, towering above her, its surface gleaming like black glass. As she reached out to touch it, her hand trembled. She could feel the electricity in the air, buzzing like a storm about to break. She hesitated for just a moment, but the whispers pushed her forward, and she obeyed. Her fingers brushed against the cold surface of the monolith. The shock of cold that jolted through her arm was like nothing she had ever felt before. It was a searing, numbing sensation that coursed through her veins, as though she had touched a live wire. The world around her spun, her vision blurring, her thoughts fragmenting. She gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts, but she couldn't pull her hand away. It was as if the structure had claimed her, had wrapped itself around her mind, locking her in place. And then, the world shifted. The walls of the cavern seemed to distort, the floor beneath her feet rising and falling like the surface of the ocean, the air growing thick with the weight of something ancient, something powerful. The whispers reached a crescendo, a maddening cacophony that rattled her very bones. The symbols on the monolith flared to life, glowing brighter, pulsing with an intensity that made her vision swim. And then, she saw it. In the heart of the structure, at the center of the glowing symbols, something stirred. It was not a shape, not a form that could be understood by the mind. It was something other, something that existed beyond the fabric of reality itself. It was the entity, the thing beneath the ocean. It was alive, and it was waking. Evelyn's vision blurred. Her senses were drowning in the flood of sounds, images, and sensations that were washing over her. Her legs felt weak, her body trembling from the overwhelming pressure that seemed to emanate from the monolith itself. She could feel it, the entity, crawling through her mind, through her very thoughts, like a parasite, burrowing its way into her consciousness. She tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mind was unraveling, her grip on reality slipping away as the whispers surged within her head, crashing against her like a tidal wave. She was losing herself. She was becoming them. But even in the depths of her terror, even as her thoughts twisted and snapped under the weight of what she had awakened, she couldn't stop herself. She couldn't stop the pull. It was too late. The extended chapter explores Evelyn's deepening obsession with Project Atlantis and her descent into madness as she uncovers the monolith and encounters the entity for the first time. Her psychological state is increasingly fragile, her reality warping as the supernatural presence grows stronger. Each step forward takes her further from her world and closer to the truth, a truth that will consume her entirely. This expanded version allows for a more detailed psychological unraveling, offering a more immersive, unsettling experience as Evelyn confronts the ancient and malevolent forces she has unknowingly awakened. Chapter 4. Into the Abyss. Evelyn's heart was a frantic drumbeat in her chest. The air around her had become thick, heavy with a humidity that pressed down on her like the weight of 1,000 tons. She tried to breathe, but each inhalation felt like she was choking on the very essence of the darkness surrounding her. It wasn't just the suffocating air. No, the atmosphere itself seemed alive, pulsating, shifting as if it could smell her fear, taste her dread. The path she walked on, or perhaps stumbled along, was indistinguishable from the world around her. The horizon stretched into nothing, and the walls she had passed seemed to melt away into a singular mass of shadow. Her feet felt weighted, like each step was dragging her into the abyss itself. "Come closer," the voice whispered, slithering into her consciousness, threading its cold fingers into her thoughts. The words were like a slow poison, spreading through her veins. She didn't want to listen, but the pull was irresistible. Her legs moved of their own accord, carried forward by an unseen force, as if the darkness itself was guiding her. She had no choice. Her body moved involuntarily, drawn toward the source of the voice. There was no longer any sign of the world she had known. No sky, no ground, no beginning, no end. Only the void. The water was thick now, more like tar than liquid, black and glossy, swirling in strange hypnotic patterns. The surface reflected nothing, not even her own face. It was like looking into a mirror made of the very fabric of the universe, a reflection that could show you everything and nothing at once. She stopped for a moment, trying to collect her thoughts, trying to understand what was happening to her. Her breath came in ragged gasps. Was this real? Was any of this real? A faint sound reached her ears, something that didn't belong in this strange, eternal place. A low, thrumming hum, like the resonation of a distant bell tolling for an end. It reverberated in her chest, deep within her bones. Her teeth rattled as the vibrations shook her to the core. The darkness shifted once again, and Evelyn blinked in confusion. The space around her warped, flickering as though it were a badly tuned television screen. A figure, tall, impossibly tall, loomed ahead, just out of reach. Its silhouette was indistinct, shifting in and out of focus as though it were made of smoke and shadow, neither fully real nor completely unreal. Evelyn's feet carried her forward, step by agonizing step, her pulse rising with each approach. And then, with a suddenness that nearly broke her fragile composure, the figure solidified. It was a woman. No, not a woman. It was something else. Its form flickered and trembled, like a fire struggling to stay alight in a storm. Its face was pale, but its features were wrong, twisted. The eyes were too wide, the mouth too small. The skin stretched taut over bones that seemed to shift beneath it, as though the figure had never been meant to exist in this world. The figure's smile was slow, deliberate, and utterly empty, a smile that seemed to stretch far too wide, like it had been stitched into place. The woman spoke, her voice impossibly soft, yet sharp as a knife, cutting through the air. "You know what this is, don't you?" Evelyn tried to speak, but no words came. She tried to move, but her body felt paralyzed, stuck in place by the crushing weight of the void around her. The woman before her leaned closer, too close, and Evelyn could feel her breath against her face, though she knew the figure should have been too far to touch her. "It's already begun," the woman continued. "You've already touched it, the thing that is now part of you." Evelyn's skin crawled. She couldn't tear her gaze away from the woman, from the figure that loomed over her like a nightmare made flesh. What was happening to her? "Come closer." The figure beckoned again, but this time it wasn't the voice alone. It was the very air, thick and suffocating, pulling her forward, urging her toward the blackened abyss. Evelyn's feet moved against her will, inch by inch, as though the ground beneath her had turned to quicksand. She tried to stop, to fight, but it was futile. She was already too far gone. Her thoughts were slipping away from her, swirling like smoke, dissolving into the heavy, oppressive fog around her. She felt as though she were being drawn into something older, something darker than anything she could comprehend. As she drew nearer to the figure, the air grew colder, colder than it had ever been before, and her breath misted in front of her. Her hands shook violently, and she realized, with a cold jolt, that she couldn't feel her fingers. They were numb. Her entire body was numb. "It's already inside you," the figure whispered, its voice a rasp that reverberated through her skull. "It's been inside you from the moment you touched the stone, from the moment you opened the door." Evelyn gasped. The stone, the monolith, she had touched it. She had opened something. But what had she opened? The figure's smile widened even further, impossibly wide, until it nearly split its face in half. The sight was so grotesque that Evelyn felt her stomach lurch. "You have seen it," it said, its voice now rising into a shrill crescendo, the words scraping against her mind. "The abyss, the end." And then, as if in a cruel mockery, the figure stepped aside, revealing the endless expanse of black water. In the distance, something moved, something vast and ancient, stirring beneath the surface. Evelyn couldn't see what it was, but she felt it. It was alive. It was waiting. "Come," the voice whispered again. A plea, a command. "You belong to us. You've always belonged to us." The water began to rise, slowly at first, then with unnatural speed. It lapped at her ankles, rising to her knees, her waist. Evelyn stumbled back, terror twisting in her gut. She turned, but the path she had walked upon was gone. All that was left was water, rising, swallowing everything in its path, rising to consume her. Panic surged through her as the water rose higher, its coldness seeping into her skin, numbing her limbs. No, she wasn't ready. She couldn't drown. Not like this. Not in this hell. The woman's face, the thing's face, grinned wider, impossibly wide. The shadows that clung to her grew, extending like dark tendrils, reaching for Evelyn, pulling at her very soul. "It is already too late," the figure purred, its voice low and hungry. "You are already one of us. There is no escape." Evelyn struggled, but the water had risen too high. It flooded over her chest, dragging her down, pulling her under. She gasped, but no air came. Her lungs burned, and her eyes stung as they filled with the dark, inky liquid. The entity's laughter echoed around her, 1,000 voices all speaking in unison, whispering her name over and over, until she couldn't tell where it began or where it ended. In her final moments, she thought she heard Samir's voice. But no, it wasn't him. It was something else, something older, something that had waited for centuries to claim her. Evelyn closed her eyes. Her body went limp as she was swallowed whole by the abyss. To be continued. In this extended and deepened version of Chapter 4, Evelyn's journey becomes more surreal and oppressive as she struggles against the entity's pull. The sense of dread intensifies, with the boundaries between reality and nightmare blurring further. Her descent is both psychological and physical, drawing her deeper into a place where she is unsure of what is real anymore, and the entity's control over her becomes absolute. The imagery here becomes more symbolic and distorted, reflecting her own internal collapse. Her fight against the entity is futile, and the chapter ends with her being consumed by the abyss, reinforcing the existential horror and the hopelessness of her situation. The looming presence of the entity continues to take hold, making it clear that there is no escape for Evelyn, only an endless descent into darkness. Chapter 5. Beneath the surface. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, but there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sense of time. She lay motionless, her limbs weighed down by an oppressive, unseen force that seemed to drain her of all life. The air around her was thick, viscous, like she was drowning in it, but there was no water, not physically, yet the suffocating weight of it pressed in on her from every angle. She couldn't see, she couldn't feel, but she was aware. She was aware of the silence, the unnatural, absolute silence. Then, she heard it. A whisper, not from one direction but from all around her. It was too soft to fully register, but there was no mistaking the intent behind the sound. The voice was there, somewhere, just beneath the surface of her mind, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. "You are not alone." Her pulse quickened. The air seemed to hum with the presence of something ancient, something powerful, but beyond her comprehension. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, like they were trying to claw their way out of the dark, invisible grave that had been dug for her. "You have always been alone." The voice was unmistakably hers, echoing through the empty space, twisting the words in a way that felt wrong, alien. It sounded like a distorted version of her own thoughts, her own words, but not quite. The voice had taken on a quality that felt like it was speaking from her, through her, but not her. It was the entity. She could feel it now, pressing against her mind, its will like a forceful tide that threatened to drown her in the depths of its control. "The world you knew is gone." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, trying to shield herself from the sensation of losing herself in the waves of the entity's words. But there was no escape, not this time, not anymore. As her breathing became shallow, her thoughts fragmented into a million pieces. The last coherent memory she could grasp was the feeling of being pulled under the surface, of drowning, sinking into something dark and endless. She had thought it was the water, but now she understood. It wasn't water, not at all. It was something worse. The darkness around her shifted. She could feel it, as though the very fabric of reality had bent around her. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and decay, and Evelyn's skin prickled with the unmistakable sense of being watched. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words wouldn't form. They were trapped within her, locked behind a barrier that was both physical and mental. "You belong to me," the voice cooed, its tone thick and suffocating. It was no longer just a whisper. It was everywhere, inside her mind, around her, in her. The presence of the entity was overwhelming. It wasn't just speaking to her. It was through her. Its thoughts wrapped around hers, like tendrils creeping into every corner of her mind, suffocating her in its cold embrace. She felt it, deep within her, a shifting darkness, an ancient force that had no beginning, no end. And then, in a moment that stretched forever, Evelyn felt the ground beneath her shift. She had no idea how she knew it, but the knowledge came to her with such certainty that she felt her heart stop beating. She was no longer alone. The water rose once more, thick and dark, but this time there was something alive within it, something new. The pulse of it, the rhythmic ebb and flow, was not natural. It was as if the water was a living organism, breathing in time with her own heartbeat. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened her eyes, but there was nothing. Only the endless darkness. The suffocating weight of it pressed against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her vision blurred, and in the blackness, shapes began to emerge. Figures, shadows, some of them humanoid, others too alien to comprehend, shifting and twitching as though they were not fully formed, not fully alive. She was surrounded, the voices, the whispering. It was no longer a faint echo, but a cacophony that filled her ears. Calling to her, demanding her. "You are the key," the voice rasped, and this time she recognized it. It was not the entity alone. It was the voice of the monolith itself. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to focus. But the figures moved faster than her mind could keep up. They twisted and undulated, their forms melting together, overlapping, as if they were made of nothing but shadow and liquid, indistinguishable from one another. "You have already opened the door," the voice continued. "Now, you will see what lies beyond." Evelyn didn't know what to do, where to turn, or how to escape. She was no longer in control of her own body. Every movement, every breath, was dictated by the entity. It was as though her physical form had become nothing more than a vessel, a puppet that danced to the entity's whim. Her mind screamed in protest, but the words died in her throat. They were silenced, not by her own fear, but by something else. The darkness around her grew more real. It wasn't just in her mind. It was in the air, in the space, in the very molecules that made up the world she had once known. She reached for something, anything, to hold on to, but her fingers grasped at empty air. She felt the cold rush of water against her legs again, rising, rising, its pulse growing more insistent. The hum grew louder, the vibrations deep inside her chest, causing her teeth to rattle, her bones to ache. And then, she felt it, a presence, a weight, a mass of something larger than herself, something that filled the space with its endless hunger. It was watching her, waiting. With a trembling hand, she reached into the dark, her fingers brushing against something slick, something warm. She gasped and pulled back, her skin burning where it had touched. "Don't touch it," the voice whispered urgently. But it was too late. The instant her fingers brushed against the surface, the world around her shattered. The walls of reality broke apart, disintegrating into fractured pieces of what had once been. The space folded in on itself, twisted and turned, and Evelyn was no longer in control. She was spinning, falling through the very fabric of the universe itself. Her mind unable to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. She was in a place without form, without time. A place where concepts like beginning and end no longer had any meaning. The shadows around her moved in patterns that had no rhyme or reason. There was no up or down, no direction, no guide. The entity's voice, now a monstrous roar, echoed all around her. "You are mine." And then all at once, the noise stopped. Silence. It was deafening. Evelyn's breath was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't hear anything, but she could feel it. The presence. the suffocating, all-encompassing force that had wrapped itself around her thoughts, around her very being. She was falling, but not into darkness, into nothingness. And then she saw it. A figure, a silhouette against the infinite void. It was standing in front of her, waiting. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming. It was the monolith, but it was alive. The form was twisted, warped. It pulsated with a life that shouldn't have been possible. Its surface was no longer solid. It was liquid, swirling, writhing. It looked at her, its 1,000 eyes staring back at her, empty, hungry, knowing. Her thoughts felt distant, as though they no longer belonged to her. "You are the one who opened it," the monolith said, its voice a chorus of 1,000 voices. "And now you will see everything." The darkness surged around her once more, and Evelyn felt herself being pulled into it, deeper than before. She didn't fight. She couldn't. She was trapped in the current, pulled into the abyss where time no longer existed. She was going somewhere, somewhere far worse than she could imagine. But at least now she understood. There was no way back. The themes are to be continued. In this development of Chapter 5, the horror intensifies as Evelyn becomes further consumed by the entity's influence. The progression of her mental and physical breakdown is coupled with a deepening sense of cosmic insignificance. The entity is no longer just a force, but an all-encompassing presence that warps reality and her very perception of self. The monolith, previously a distant object of dread, becomes more terrifying, alive, and sentient, pulling Evelyn and the reader deeper into a hellish realm where escape is impossible, and where the boundaries of reality and nightmare cease to exist. Chapter 5. Beneath the surface. Evelyn's eyes snapped open, but there was nothing. No light, no sound, no sense of time. She lay motionless, her limbs weighed down by an oppressive, unseen force that seemed to drain her of all life. The air around her was thick, viscous, like she was drowning in it, but there was no water, not physically. Yet the suffocating weight of it pressed in on her from every angle. She couldn't see, she couldn't feel, but she was aware. She was aware of the silence, the unnatural, absolute silence. Then she heard it. A whisper, not from one direction, but from all around her. It was too soft to fully register, but there was no mistaking the intent behind the sound. The voice was there, somewhere, just beneath the surface of her mind, like a forgotten memory trying to resurface. "You are not alone." Her pulse quickened. The air seemed to hum with the presence of something ancient, something powerful, but beyond her comprehension. She tried to move, but her body wouldn't obey. Her fingers twitched involuntarily, like they were trying to claw their way out of the dark, invisible grave that had been dug for her. "You have always been alone." The voice was unmistakably hers, echoing through the empty space, twisting the words in a way that felt wrong, alien. It sounded like a distorted version of her own thoughts, her own words, but not quite. The voice had taken on a quality that felt like it was speaking from her, through her, but not her. It was the entity. She could feel it now, pressing against her mind. Its will like a forceful tide that threatened to drown her in the depths of its control. "The world you knew is gone." Evelyn squeezed her eyes shut, trying to block out the sound, trying to shield herself from the sensation of losing herself in the waves of the entity's words. But there was no escape. Not this time. Not anymore. As her breathing became shallow, her thoughts fragmented into a million pieces. The last coherent memory she could grasp was the feeling of being pulled under the surface, of drowning, sinking into something dark and endless. She had thought it was the water. But now she understood. It wasn't water. Not at all. It was something worse. The darkness around her shifted. She could feel it, as though the very fabric of reality had bent around her. The air grew thick with the scent of salt and decay, and Evelyn's skin prickled with the unmistakable sense of being watched. She wanted to scream, to cry out, but the words wouldn't form. They were trapped within her, locked behind a barrier that was both physical and mental. "You belong to me," the voice cooed, its tone thick and suffocating. It was no longer just a whisper. It was everywhere. Inside her mind, around her, in her. The presence of the entity was overwhelming. It wasn't just speaking to her, it was through her. Its thoughts wrapped around hers, like tendrils creeping into every corner of her mind, suffocating her in its cold embrace. She felt it, deep within her, a shifting darkness, an ancient force that had no beginning, no end. And then, in a moment that stretched forever, Evelyn felt the ground beneath her shift. She had no idea how she knew it, but the knowledge came to her with such certainty that she felt her heart stop beating. She was no longer alone. The water rose once more, thick and dark, but this time there was something alive within it. Something new. The pulse of it, the rhythmic ebb and flow, was not natural. It was as if the water was a living organism, breathing in time with her own heartbeat. Her breath caught in her throat as she opened her eyes, but there was nothing, only the endless darkness. The suffocating weight of it pressed against her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. Her vision blurred, and in the blackness, shapes began to emerge. Figures. Shadows. Some of them humanoid, others too alien to comprehend, shifting and twitching as though they were not fully formed, not fully alive. She was surrounded. The voices, the whispering. It was no longer a faint echo, but a cacophony that filled her ears, calling to her, demanding her. "You are the key," the voice rasped, and this time she recognized it. It was not the entity alone. It was the voice of the monolith itself. She blinked rapidly, forcing herself to focus, but the figures moved faster than her mind could keep up. They twisted and undulated, their forms melting together, overlapping, as if they were made of nothing but shadow and liquid, indistinguishable from one another. "You have already opened the door," the voice continued. "Now, you will see what lies beyond." Evelyn didn't know what to do, where to turn, or how to escape. She was no longer in control of her own body. Every movement, every breath, was dictated by the entity. It was as though her physical form had become nothing more than a vessel, a puppet that danced to the entity's whim. Her mind screamed in protest, but the words died in her throat. They were silenced, not by her own fear, but by something else. The darkness around her grew more real. It wasn't just in her mind. It was in the air, in the space, in the very molecules that made up the world she had once known. She reached for something, anything to hold on to, but her fingers grasped at empty air. She felt the cold rush of water against her legs again, rising, rising, its pulse growing more insistent. The hum grew louder, the vibrations deep inside her chest, causing her teeth to rattle, her bones to ache. And then, she felt it. A presence, a weight, a mass of something larger than herself, something that filled the space with its endless hunger. It was watching her, waiting. With a trembling hand, she reached into the dark, her fingers brushing against something slick, something warm. She gasped and pulled back, her skin burning where it had touched. "Don't touch it," the voice whispered urgently. But it was too late. The instant her fingers brushed against the surface, the world around her shattered. The walls of reality broke apart, disintegrating into fractured pieces of what had once been. The space folded in on itself, twisted and turned, and Evelyn was no longer in control. She was spinning, falling through the very fabric of the universe itself, her mind unable to comprehend the enormity of what was happening. She was in a place without form, without time, a place where concepts like beginning and end no longer had any meaning. The shadows around her moved in patterns that had no rhyme or reason. There was no up or down, no direction, no guide. The entity's voice, now a monstrous roar, echoed all around her. "You are mine." And then, all at once, the noise stopped. Silence. It was deafening. Evelyn's breath was ragged, her heart pounding in her chest. She couldn't hear anything, but she could feel it. The presence. The suffocating, all-encompassing force that had wrapped itself around her thoughts, around her very being. She was falling, but not into darkness, into nothingness. And then she saw it. A figure, a silhouette against the infinite void. It was standing in front of her, waiting. It didn't move, didn't speak, but its presence was overwhelming. It was the monolith, but it was alive. The form was twisted, warped. It pulsated with a life that shouldn't have been possible. Its surface was no longer solid. It was liquid, swirling, writhing. It looked at her, its 1,000 eyes staring back at her, empty, hungry, knowing. Her thoughts felt distant, as though they no longer belonged to her. "You are the one who opened it," the monolith said, its voice a chorus of 1,000 voices. "And now you will see everything." The darkness surged around her once more, and Evelyn felt herself being pulled into it, deeper than before. She didn't fight. She couldn't. She was trapped in the current, pulled into the abyss where time no longer existed. She was going somewhere far worse than she could imagine. But at least now she understood. There was no way back. To be continued. This development of Chapter 5, the horror intensifies as Evelyn becomes further consumed by the entity's influence. The progression of her mental and physical breakdown is coupled with a deepening sense of cosmic insignificance. The entity is no longer just a force, but an all-encompassing presence that warps reality and her very perception of self. The monolith, previously a distant object of dread, becomes more terrifying, alive and sentient, pulling Evelyn and the reader deeper into a hellish realm where escape is impossible, and where the boundaries of reality and nightmare cease to exist. Chapter 6. Beneath the Veil. Evelyn's sense of time had collapsed. She could no longer tell how long it had been since she had last felt the warmth of sunlight, since she had last heard the murmur of human voices. Days. Months, years, it didn't matter. Nothing mattered anymore. There was only the silence, the oppressive, all-encompassing silence that stretched endlessly into the void. But it wasn't truly silent. No, the silence was deceptive. There was a hum beneath it, a vibration that pressed against her eardrums, worming its way into her skull, reverberating in the deepest, most primal parts of her mind. It was constant, like the pulse of some ancient sleeping beast stirring beneath the earth, waiting for the right moment to wake. She could feel it, that heavy weight pressing down on her. It was as if reality itself had turned inside out, folding in on itself until nothing made sense. She was here, but not here. She could still feel her body, yet she couldn't truly see it. Her limbs moved, but with an alien stiffness, as though they were no longer her own. Her breath caught in her throat, the air thick and oppressive as if it were laced with something wrong. She forced herself to move, her feet dragging through a terrain that didn't seem to have a texture or shape. It was as though she were walking through a memory, her feet never quite connecting with the ground, as if the world was made of mist and shadows. "Come closer," a voice whispered, low and guttural, barely a breath against her ear. She froze, the hairs on her neck standing on end. It was the same voice she had heard before, the voice of the entity. But it was not the same. No, this voice was darker, more insistent, as if it had become impatient with her resistance. Evelyn turned her head, but there was no one there, only the void. The endless, black nothingness that stretched around her like a thick blanket, smothering every trace of light, every shred of hope. She took a hesitant step forward, her feet sinking into the soft, shadowy ground as if the world were trying to swallow her whole. The darkness seemed to ripple in response, like the surface of a disturbed lake. She wasn't alone. She knew that now. Something was watching her. "You've come too far to turn back," the voice continued, its tone now a low growl, filled with a dark, ancient power. The words were not spoken. They were felt, vibrating through her skin, crawling beneath her flesh. It wasn't just a voice. It was a presence, something alive. Evelyn's pulse quickened, the fear clawing its way back into her chest, but she could not move. She had long since abandoned the idea of escape. The entity had made sure of that. It had locked her in this place, a prison built of her own mind and the entity's will. She could feel it, the insidious pull of its presence, like a chain wrapped around her thoughts, dragging her deeper into the abyss. The ground beneath her feet shifted again, a low, groaning sound emanating from somewhere deep within the darkness. Her breath caught in her throat as a crack appeared in the air before her, splitting the void open like a wound. And then something emerged. A shape, a figure. It was tall. Impossibly tall, its outline shifting and undulating like a mirage. Evelyn's heart began to race as she stared at the form. It was not entirely humanoid, nor was it entirely alien. It was something in between, something that existed outside of the laws of nature, something that couldn't be understood by a mind still tethered to the physical world. The figure was cloaked in shadows, its limbs elongated, its body a twisted silhouette that seemed to distort the very space around it. Its face, or what might have been a face, was hidden beneath a veil of darkness, a deep, impenetrable blackness that consumed the space around it. "You've been chosen," the voice spoke again, and Evelyn realized with a chill that it was coming from this creature. From it. The being's mouth didn't move, but the words vibrated through the air, resonating in her skull. She tried to move again, to step back, but her legs wouldn't obey her. They were frozen, anchored to the spot by some invisible force, some unspoken command. She was trapped in a place where nothing made sense, where the very nature of existence was being twisted, unraveled, and remade according to the whims of the entity. The figure took a step toward her. No, it wasn't a step. It shifted, its form blurring and rippling as though it were made of liquid, flowing forward in an instant. Evelyn's breath caught as she instinctively recoiled, but there was nowhere to go. The entity's presence surrounded her, pressing in from all sides, suffocating her. "You belong to me," the creature whispered, its voice now a low, vibrating hum that seemed to echo in her bones. The words were like an incantation, a spell that wrapped itself around her mind, sinking deeper and deeper with each passing second. Her body trembled as she felt the weight of its words, the weight of its power. She was not in control. She never had been. She was a part of it now, just as much a part of the darkness as the entity itself. It had already claimed her, body, mind, and soul. The shadows surrounding her began to twist and warp, the very air becoming thick with a kind of malice, a dark energy that pulsed in time with her heartbeat. It was as though she were drowning in it, suffocating under the weight of it all. She could feel the pressure building, the air growing thicker, colder. Her vision began to blur at the edges, as though the world itself was beginning to unravel. "You are mine now," the voice whispered again, its tone almost fond. Evelyn's eyes darted around in panic, but there was nothing to see, nothing but the shifting darkness. The shape that had appeared before her was still there, looming just out of reach, its presence like a shadow on her soul. But now, it was joined by more figures, more shapes that seemed to emerge from the cracks in reality itself, swirling in and out of existence, flickering like the dying embers of a fire. They were watching her. "You've always belonged to me," the voice whispered again. But this time, it wasn't just a whisper. It was everywhere. It was inside her. It was in her thoughts, in her dreams. It was her. The realization hit her like a thunderclap. This wasn't just about the entity. This was about her. She had always been a part of it. She had always been destined to become part of the darkness. There was no escape from it, no way to break free. In the distance, the figures continued to shift, merging and breaking apart like a fluid mass. The air grew colder still, and Evelyn could feel the temperature of the void sink into her very bones. Her thoughts became disjointed, fragmented, like shards of glass spinning away from the center of her mind. It was as if the very fabric of reality was being torn apart around her. She felt herself being pulled. No, dragged. Her body was no longer her own. She could feel it being moved, shifted, as though it were being guided by an unseen hand. Her limbs flailed, but they had no power, no strength to move on their own. She was a marionette, her strings controlled by the entity. "Come closer," the voice beckoned once more, its tone dark and soothing, as though it were guiding her to some inevitable end. Evelyn closed her eyes, her head spinning, and for the first time since she had entered this place, she felt a flicker of something familiar, a memory. It was so distant, so fragmented that it was like trying to recall a dream from childhood, something that seemed so real yet just out of reach. It was her name, Evelyn. The voice cut through the haze of her thoughts. It was a question, a demand. Evelyn. She didn't know how, but she felt herself drawn toward the sound. She reached for it, her fingers trembling as she reached out into the void, grasping for anything that would bring her back to herself, back to the world she had known. But there was nothing, only the endless abyss, stretching out before her like a mouth ready to swallow her whole. The entity's presence surged again, and Evelyn felt it inside her, all around her. It was too much, too overwhelming. It was no longer just a part of her. It was her. And as the darkness closed in around her, Evelyn finally understood. She was no longer human. She was the entity. And the entity was her. Chapter 7. The Hollow Heart. Evelyn's existence had become a labyrinth, a twisting, suffocating maze of dark corridors and shifting walls that defied all logic. Time no longer had meaning. There was only the entity, and the gnawing realization that she was no longer separate from it. She had become a part of it, woven into its fabric. It had been days, weeks, or had it been years, since she had been swallowed by this place, this distorted version of reality that existed somewhere between the waking world and the nightmare realm. The air in the darkened corridors was thick, heavy with a stench of decay that clung to her skin and stung her nostrils. Every breath was like inhaling the remnants of something long dead. The oppressive silence suffocated her mind, leaving her with nothing but the echoes of her own thoughts and the low hum of the entity's presence. The entity. Its voice was always there, swirling around her mind like a cold wind, wrapping itself around her thoughts and tugging at her soul. "Come closer," it would whisper. "You belong to me." The words were insistent, relentless, like the beat of a heart that never stopped, never ceased. Each time the entity spoke, a part of her soul shuddered in recognition. She had stopped questioning its nature. She had stopped trying to understand it. There was no understanding, no escape from what she had become. She had lost herself to it, and now there was nothing left to fight for. The last thread of her humanity had snapped, unraveling piece by piece as she descended deeper into this hellish place. But still, some primal instinct, kept her moving forward. It wasn't hope. No, hope had long since abandoned her. This was something darker, something driven by the desperation of a mind that could no longer comprehend its own reality. She walked, her feet dragging across the smooth, slick surface of the corridor. The ground was cold beneath her, colder than the air, and it sent a shiver through her bones each time her foot made contact. There were no doors, no windows, no markings, no signposts. The walls were featureless, stretching upward until they melted into the blackness above. The very architecture seemed to breathe, to shift, as if it were alive. It pulsated with an energy that was almost tactile, an unseen force that seemed to push against her with every step. There were moments when Evelyn thought she saw something, flickers of movement at the edge of her vision, shadows that scurried just beyond the reach of her gaze. But when she turned to look, there was nothing, just the same endless corridor, stretching on for eternity. Suddenly there was a sound, a soft scraping noise, a subtle rustling, like something moving in the dark. Evelyn stopped, her breath catching in her throat. Her heart began to thud in her chest, a heavy, echoing rhythm that made her feel like a drum being struck from within. She didn't dare move. She didn't even dare breathe. The sound came again, this time louder, closer. The walls of the corridor began to ripple, the smooth surface warping as though they were being manipulated from the inside. A shudder ran through the air, as if the very fabric of the place was stretching and cracking under some unseen pressure. Then, from the shadows, something appeared. At first it was just a shape, a dark silhouette that materialized at the end of the hall. Evelyn's body tensed, her muscles locking into place as she stared at the form, trying to discern its nature. It was tall, taller than any human should be. Its limbs were elongated, impossibly so, and its face, or what might have been a face, was obscured by shadows, a void where its features should have been. And yet, Evelyn could feel it. She could feel the presence of this thing, just as she had felt the entity in the depths of her mind. It was the same, yet different. An echo, a reflection, The figure did not move at first. It simply stood there watching her. Its stillness was unnerving, a kind of eerie patience that seemed to stretch time itself, making every second feel like an eternity. Evelyn's pulse quickened, her throat dry and tight. Her mind screamed for her to run, but her legs were rooted to the spot. She couldn't move. She couldn't escape. She could only feel the pull of the entity, its unseen influence creeping in from all around her, tightening its grip. And then it spoke, not with words. No, there were no words. But the voice, the presence of the entity, pulsed through the air, filling her mind with 1,000 whispered commands. It was inside her, vibrating in her skull, in her thoughts, until she could no longer separate its will from her own. "You've always known," the entity's voice echoed inside her, reverberating in the core of her being. Evelyn's breath caught in her throat. She didn't understand. She didn't want to understand. "You've always known who you are. What you are." The figure in front of her shifted then, as though it were made of shadows and smoke. It stepped forward, its movements fluid, impossibly fast. Evelyn's body jerked backward, but still, her feet were frozen. She was stuck, trapped in the web the entity had woven around her. The figure stopped just inches from her, its presence overwhelming. It was inside her now, filling her senses with the scent of rot, the taste of iron. She could feel it, a dark, suffocating weight pressing against her chest, against her lungs. It was everywhere. There was no escaping it. And then it happened. The thing, the figure, reached out a hand, or what passed for a hand. Its fingers were long, unnaturally thin, stretching toward her with a deliberate slowness that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Evelyn wanted to scream, to cry out, but the sound caught in her throat. The figure's hand brushed against her skin. The touch was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, like ice pressed against the marrow of her bones. It seeped through her, numbing her, making her feel as though her very soul was freezing. And then, there was a flash, a memory, a vision. She saw herself. No, it saw her, a reflection of her past, twisted, distorted. She was standing in a room, once her own, now empty. The walls bled shadows, dark shapes moving behind the curtains, watching her with hungry eyes. The air was thick with the scent of something burning, something wrong. Her heart pounded in her chest as she saw the figure again, standing behind her in the reflection. Its face was clearer now, no longer obscured by shadows, but a blank mask, devoid of any feature, just a hollow void staring back at her, empty and dark. "You belong to me," the voice said again, but this time it wasn't just a whisper. It was a command, a decree. Evelyn closed her eyes, but the vision didn't fade. She could still feel the figure's hand on her skin, still hear the entity's voice inside her head. It was becoming too much. The walls of her mind were collapsing, being consumed by the darkness, the void that had been waiting for her all along. She was no longer just in the entity's grasp. She was the entity, and it was her. To be continued. This expanded chapter continues Evelyn's slow descent into the abyss, highlighting the haunting, psychological horror of her situation. It delves deeper into her internal struggle as she begins to lose her sense of self and merge with the entity's power. The writing builds tension through vivid descriptions and unsettling imagery, creating an atmosphere that keeps the reader on edge, unsure of what is real and what is a nightmare. Chapter 8. The collapse of self. The deeper Evelyn ventured into the darkness, the less she recognized herself. It wasn't just the physical surroundings that distorted around her, though they were grotesque enough to unnerve even the most steadfast mind. The very essence of her being, the core of who she had once been, was becoming alien to her, twisted beyond recognition. Every thought, every emotion felt foreign, as if they no longer originated from her own mind, but were being whispered into her by something else, something older, something far more powerful, the entity. She had long since lost the ability to discern where it began and where she ended. Its presence had become so pervasive, so thoroughly entwined with her own consciousness, that the lines between them blurred until there was nothing left but the blackness, the relentless pull, and the hum of its voice in her mind. "You are nothing but a shadow," it would say, a reflection of a broken soul. And as the words spilled into her thoughts, she no longer felt the sting of defiance that had once surged within her. There was only acceptance now, resignation. The entity was a part of her, and she was a part of it. Inescapable, unavoidable. At times, she couldn't remember who she had been before this descent. There were flashes of memories, flickering, fractured images of a life she no longer recognized. Her own name, her face, the people she once loved. But these memories were like ghosts, drifting on the periphery of her mind, too faint to hold on to, too fleeting to make sense of. Her body moved with a will of its own, each step dragging her deeper into the dark. Her eyes unable to see, yet her mind perceiving every detail. The air around her was thick, suffocating, a stale weight that pressed against her lungs. It smelled of rot, of earth that had been buried too long, of something forgotten and long past. The void seemed endless. She tried to focus, to anchor herself to something familiar, but her attempts to cling to her own identity were met with an overwhelming sense of disorientation. She felt herself shifting, her body, her thoughts, her very essence, becoming part of something vast and alien. Her footsteps echoed through the endless, featureless corridors, a hollow sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep within her chest. She reached out for something, anything, but the air was empty. There was nothing but the ever-present, suffocating silence. No doors, no windows, just the oppressive dark and the whisper of the entity, its breath crawling through her mind like the slow turn of a key in a lock. The entity's voice surged in her mind again, but this time it was different. It was more intimate, more personal. It was like a hand slipping beneath her skin, burrowing deep into the very marrow of her soul. "I am you," it breathed, and there was no malice in its tone. There was no anger, no hate. There was only calm, absolute certainty. "You have always been mine. From the moment you were born, you were never truly free." Evelyn froze, a chill sweeping down her spine. Her heart stuttered in her chest, the beat erratic and jagged as the words reverberated through her skull. Born? She tried to recall her origins, the time before this dark world had consumed her. The memory was so distant, so dim, that it felt like trying to grasp at smoke. "Your body is a prison," the entity continued, its voice now laced with a cold satisfaction. "You were born to serve me. All of you, every piece, has always belonged to me." Evelyn couldn't speak. She didn't want to. The weight of the words crushed her, pressing her down into the blackness, erasing whatever fragile sense of herself she had clung to. There was no escape, no place to run, but still she walked. She wasn't sure why. Maybe it was habit, maybe it was instinct, or maybe, as the entity had told her, she had no choice. Her body moved without her will, dragging her forward, down corridors that seemed to stretch for eternity. Then, just as the oppressive silence threatened to overwhelm her, something changed. The air thickened, the ground trembled beneath her feet, a low vibration that rippled through the floor and up her legs. It wasn't an earthquake, but something far more sinister, a disturbance in the fabric of reality itself. The walls began to warp, the smooth surfaces rippling like water disturbed by an unseen hand. She reached out instinctively, her fingers brushing against the shifting walls, feeling them bend, twist, as if they were made of living matter. The entity was stirring. "You are closer now," it whispered in her mind, the words curling around her like a snake. "Can you feel it? The truth is almost here, the truth of what you are." A flicker of something real surfaced within her. The sensation was fleeting, but for a moment, she felt a wave of terror that wasn't the entity's, but her own. She was afraid. Of what? She didn't know. The blackness was closing in, pressing against her, suffocating her. She wanted to scream, but her voice was lost in the endless void. The sound of footsteps, not her own but someone else's. Evelyn stopped, her breath catching in her throat as the dark shadows before her seemed to part. Figures emerged from the blackness, slowly at first, like ghosts taking form. Tall and thin, their forms distorted by the gloom, their faces featureless, empty. They moved toward her, their movements fluid, unnervingly graceful. Their limbs were long, and their heads tilted in unnatural ways, as though they were watching her from every angle at once. They are mine as well, the entity murmured. You will join them. Fear curled in Evelyn's chest like a fist. Join them? Were these figures part of the entity too? Were they her? The shadows swirled around her, closing in, surrounding her. The air thickened with their presence, and Evelyn could feel herself sinking deeper, her mind fraying at the edges. The figures drew closer, their shapes shifting like liquid shadows, their eyes, those empty, hollow eyes, fixated on her, burning through her skin, through her very soul. She tried to move, but her legs were heavy, as though they were made of stone. The entity's influence was too strong now, pulling her toward the figures, toward the darkness. It was inevitable. They are the echoes of you, the entity whispered. Shadows of what you could have been, but never were. Her vision blurred, the shadows closed in, their bodies brushing against hers with a sickening softness. Evelyn's skin prickled, her pulse racing as their touch sent waves of cold through her veins, draining the warmth from her body. In that moment, everything shifted. Her surroundings collapsed. The world around her fractured like glass, breaking into 1,000 jagged pieces. The figures, the shadows, the walls, all of it disappeared. The blackness swallowed it whole, leaving her standing on the precipice of something far worse. The reality of her existence had crumbled, and in its place was something incomprehensible, a vast yawning abyss that stretched far beyond the limits of her mind. You are one with me now. The entity's voice reverberated, deep and all-encompassing. Welcome home. Evelyn's chest tightened. Her breath was shallow, quick. She was falling into that abyss, and there was no way to stop it. The fear that had once held her back, the humanity she had fought to preserve, it was all gone. She was consumed by it, by the entity, by the darkness. There was no escape. The abyss whispered her name, and she answered. To be continued. This expanded version of Chapter 8 delves even further into Evelyn's descent into madness and her increasing fusion with the entity. The psychological horror intensifies, and her identity continues to erode as she merges with the darkness. The atmosphere grows more oppressive, with the figures and the distorted reality representing the collapse of her sense of self. The tone remains eerie, filled with a sense of inevitability and suffocating dread. Chapter 9. The Descent into Oblivion. Evelyn no longer recognized the world around her. It was as if the very ground beneath her feet had ceased to be real, a phantom surface that shifted and warbled like the ripples on water. And the air, God, the air, had become thick and oppressive, laden with the scent of decay and something far worse, something ancient and untouchable. It was as though the atmosphere itself had turned against her, pressing in on her from all sides, closing in like a vice around her chest. She could feel it, the weight of it, pushing down on her lungs, making each breath more labored, more desperate than the last. Yet no matter how much she struggled for air, she couldn't escape it. You are no longer just a person, the entity whispered to her, and for a moment, Evelyn wondered if it was speaking out loud, or if the words were simply seeping into her brain like ink spreading across a page. You are part of something greater now, something beyond comprehension. You are us. The words settled over her like a thick, wet blanket, smothering her, binding her. There had been a time, just a sliver of a time, when she had believed she could resist, when she had convinced herself that the entity was an external force, something separate from her, something she could fight. But now it was part of her. It was in her bones, in her blood, in the deepest crevices of her mind. The very notion of separation felt absurd. She was the entity was her, and it was both beautiful and terrifying in its sheer finality. Her hands trembled as she reached out, not quite sure what she was expecting to grasp. There was no longer a point in distinguishing between her body and the world around her. She had stopped being a person in any meaningful sense. She was just a vessel, a channel through which the entity's will flowed, an instrument of its vast, incomprehensible purpose. She took another step forward, her feet sinking into the dark earth beneath her. The ground was soft, as if it were still living, breathing, pulsing with some malevolent force. She could feel the earth beneath her skin, not just touching her, but reaching for her, as if it were trying to pull her deeper, pull her into it, pull her apart, and remake her into something else entirely. The soil clung to her skin, wet and clammy, as though it recognized her, as though it knew her intimately, had always known her. Evelyn couldn't remember the last time she had seen light. It felt like an eternity ago, an age of time long past, forgotten. She could not remember how she had arrived here, how she had stepped through that final crack in the fabric of reality. It was as if the very concept of time had become meaningless. Each moment felt like it stretched on forever, but each moment was also an eternity away from the last, an endless loop that twisted upon itself, a paradox that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. Is this the end? She thought. But the thought felt hollow, as if the very notion of an end was a concept too far removed from her grasp. But she didn't have time to ponder that. Not now. No. There was something else. Something pressing. She could feel it. A shift in the air. A tremor in the ground beneath her feet. The shadows around her seemed to deepen, to grow in response to something that was approaching. A sound, a distant hum, reached her ears, growing louder, closer. It was unlike any sound she had ever heard before. It was not the hum of machinery or the buzz of an electrical current. No, this was something more primal, more ancient. It was the sound of the very fabric of reality straining, stretching, tearing at the seams, ready to break apart under the weight of something immense. And then, like a scream from the depths of her subconscious, the voice of the entity returned. But it was no longer a whisper. Now it was louder, stronger, its presence filling her mind, flooding it like a torrential wave. "It is time," the entity said. Its voice was no longer just inside her head. It was everywhere. It was the very air she breathed, the very ground she walked upon. It was in the pulse of her heartbeat, in the rhythm of her thoughts. You have been prepared. You are ready. Ready. Ready for what? The ground began to tremble, harder now, as though the earth itself was waking up, as though it was shaking off the weight of an ancient slumber. The darkness around her seemed to twist and bend, pulling in on itself like a whirlpool. She could feel it, the distortion in the air, like something shifting, something unfolding beneath her feet. And then, without warning, the earth before her split open. A massive crack, wide enough to swallow a mountain, split through the ground, sending a shower of dirt and stone flying into the air. The sound of it was deafening, the force of it like a thunderclap that rattled her very bones. She stumbled back, hands instinctively reaching for something solid, anything to ground herself. But there was nothing. There was only the crack, a yawning chasm that seemed to stretch into the very heart of the world, into the void itself. Out of the crack emerged something that wasn't human, wasn't even of this world. At first it was a shadow, a shape that loomed just beyond the edge of perception, like a towering silhouette standing at the threshold of reality. It was tall, impossibly tall, its body covered in dark, chitinous armor that gleamed with an otherworldly light. Its eyes, if they could even be called eyes, were two glowing orbs that seemed to pierce through the darkness, shining with a sickly, malevolent light. It wasn't just the figure itself that filled her with terror, though. It was the presence, the sheer weight of it. The air seemed to warp and twist around it, bending to its will as though the very laws of physics had been torn asunder. Evelyn's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She wanted to run. She should have run, but her body refused. Her legs refused. She stood frozen, as though her feet had been rooted to the spot by some unseen force. The entity was with her now, in her, its presence filling every fibre of her being, drowning out all other thoughts. There was no room for fear, no space for doubt. There was only the entity and its will. "You have brought it," the voice spoke again, but this time it was not the entity's voice. It was a voice that had never been heard by human ears, a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, a voice that resonated in the very bones of the earth. "You have awakened it. The time of reckoning has come." The figure in the chasm took a step forward, its movement slow but deliberate. As it stepped into the space before her, the darkness parted around it, like a curtain being drawn back to reveal some unspeakable truth. Evelyn's body trembled, not from fear, but from something else, something deeper, something unavoidable. Her body, her mind, her very soul. She could feel them surrendering to it, to the entity, to the call. "It is time to join," the voice repeated, its tone now a command, resonating through every fibre of her being. "It is time to become." Evelyn's eyes drifted shut. She couldn't stop herself. The pull was too strong now, the gravity of the entity's will dragging her in. Join. Become. It was the last thing she heard before the chasm closed around her, swallowing her whole, leaving nothing but the suffocating darkness and the entity. And to be continued. But this chapter delves deeper into Evelyn's psychological descent, exploring the unraveling of her identity as she surrenders fully to the entity. The atmosphere is oppressive and disorienting, with the growing presence of an otherworldly force, the entity, taking control of not just Evelyn, but her surroundings as well. The long, meandering prose is designed to give a sense of unease and claustrophobia, amplifying the horror of the inevitable collapse of her selfhood. The chapter ends on an ominous note, with Evelyn's fate seemingly sealed. Chapter 10. The Final Embrace. Evelyn's mind had become a shattered mirror, its fractured pieces reflecting 1,000 versions of herself, none of them real. The ground beneath her was no longer solid, no longer even there. It was as though the world itself had evaporated, leaving only the endless, bottomless void in its place. The darkness was absolute. No light, no sound, no breath. Just the oppressive weight of silence pressing in from every direction. A suffocating force that threatened to collapse her from the inside out. And yet, even in this suffocating darkness, she could feel it. The entity. It was no longer a presence on the periphery of her consciousness. It had become her. There was no line anymore, no boundary between them. It was not something that existed outside of her, but something that inhabited her, like a shadow woven into the very fabric of her soul. She could no longer tell where she ended and it began. The thoughts that whispered in her mind were her own, and yet they were not. The voice that echoed in her head was both foreign and intimately familiar. "You are mine," the entity whispered, its voice resonating through her entire being, reverberating in every cell, every nerve. "You always were." She didn't resist. She couldn't. The weight of its words, of its truth, pressed down on her like a physical force, too powerful to deny. The concept of rebellion was as meaningless as the idea of light in this endless, consuming dark. There was nothing but the entity. There was nothing but this. She could no longer even remember the face of the person she had once been. Evelyn. Was that her name? Or was it just another forgotten echo in the endless chasm of her fractured mind? She clung to it for a moment, but it slipped through her fingers like sand, too insubstantial to hold on to. Her body felt wrong, alien. The bones beneath her skin had reshaped, the muscles had twisted into something new, something other. Her very form had begun to warp, to conform to the will of the entity. It was no longer flesh and blood, but something more insidious. Something living, but not truly alive. Her senses, what was left of them, no longer worked in the way they once had. She could feel the pulse of the entity within her, its presence wrapping around her like an oppressive cloak. It was everywhere, inside her, around her, through her. It was all there was. All there could be. The darkness began to hum, a low, rhythmic vibration that seemed to come from the very core of the void. It was like the sound of a heartbeat, but it wasn't hers. It was something else, something ancient. "Do you hear it?" the entity asked, its voice a soft caress. The sound of existence unraveling, the pulse of the end. Evelyn didn't answer. She didn't need to. The hum was all-encompassing. It resonated within her, through her, until it was the only sound she knew. She had ceased to be Evelyn. She had ceased to be anyone at all. She was simply the entity. It was her, and she was it. There was no distinction, no separation, no escape. And then, as though the fabric of reality itself were being ripped apart, a new sensation took over her mind. The presence. It was more than just a feeling. It was a force. It wasn't like the entity, which had slowly entwined with her until she was indistinguishable from it. This was something older, something more primordial. It was the force of creation itself, the beginning and the end of all things. It was the source of the entity, the origin from which all darkness flowed. It filled her, consumed her, and in that moment, Evelyn realized with a kind of horrifying clarity that the world had never been real. None of it had been. The faces, the voices, the emotions, the pain. It was all an illusion, a transient shadow cast by the true force behind all things, the entity. And now, the presence was with her. It was one, with her. It was time. With the thought, the darkness around her shifted. The walls, which had been nothing but shadow and emptiness, began to ripple. The air thickened, and Evelyn could feel the change, the stirring of something vast, something monumental. She could feel the entity's presence swelling within her, surging through her veins, suffusing every part of her being. She was aware of herself, but at the same time she wasn't. She felt herself stretching, extending, becoming, as if she were expanding beyond the confines of her physical form. She was no longer trapped by the limits of flesh and bone. She was part of the void itself now. She was the darkness. She was the end. And then it happened. The very air around her shattered. A sudden, deafening silence, followed by an explosion of sound that rang in her ears like the thunderclap of a million storms. The reality that had once seemed so solid, so real, broke apart in an instant, disintegrating into nothingness. And with that, Evelyn was no longer alone. The figures appeared, coalescing out of the blackness, rising from the void like phantoms. They were tall, their bodies shifting and contorting in unnatural ways, their faces like masks of silent anguish. They were her, but not her, echoes of what she had once been, shadows of her existence, twisted and warped by the entity's will. They hovered in the air around her, their movements jerky and alien, their hollow eyes watching her with an intensity that sent a chill creeping down her spine. "They are you." The entity's voice filled her mind again. "Shadows of your past, your regrets. They are the essence of your former self, the pieces you left behind." Evelyn's mind reeled, but she had no room to resist. The figures were closing in on her now, surrounding her, circling her. There was no escape. She was surrounded, engulfed by her own fragmented soul. "Join them," the entity whispered, and the words sent a wave of cold through her. "You are already one with them." Evelyn couldn't speak. She didn't need to. She was no longer Evelyn. She was something else entirely. And then the figures reached out. They were her, but they weren't. The shadows that had once been part of her were now pulling her in, enveloping her in their cold embrace. She felt them crawl into her, their presence seeping into her skin, into her mind, into her very being. It was a slow, agonizing process, as though each shadow were claiming its piece of her, one fragment at a time. Her body twisted in ways that defied nature, her bones creaking and shifting, reshaping themselves under the influence of the entity. Her screams were silent. She was no longer capable of such things. There was only the overwhelming, suffocating presence of the entity, the force that had consumed her and would continue to consume everything. And then it was over. The figures that had once been her were gone, absorbed back into the darkness. The world around her had dissolved into an endless expanse of blackness. No walls, no ground, no sky. There was only nothingness, infinite and eternal. But even in that nothingness, Evelyn's essence remained. For she was no longer Evelyn. She was the entity. She was the darkness. She was the end. And the entity was now complete. The end. This final chapter brings a somber, horrifying conclusion to Evelyn's journey. The blending of her identity with the entity reaches its peak, and she is lost to the infinite void, becoming one with the darkness. The cosmic horror elements come into full play, as the reader witnesses the erasure of Evelyn's very existence, swallowed by the vast, inevitable pull of the entity. The atmosphere is thick with despair and inevitability, and the conclusion leaves a haunting sense of finality. Epilogue. The silence beyond the world, as it once was, no longer exists. It was never meant to last, not really. Perhaps it was always doomed, a fragile illusion woven into the fabric of time, destined to crumble under the weight of forces far beyond human comprehension. And now, all that remains is silence. A profound, unbroken silence that stretches out forever. A silence that isn't just the absence of sound, but the absence of everything. The absence of time, of reality itself. Evelyn's name has long since faded into nothingness, a whisper carried away on a wind that no longer blows. Her form, her being, has been swallowed by the very darkness she once feared. She is no longer Evelyn. She is no longer even a thought. In her place only the entity remains. And the entity was the darkness. It was the end. It was the beginning. And it would continue, endlessly, beyond the reach of mortal comprehension, beyond the borders of time and space, beyond all things that could be seen or known. There is no escape. There is no return. What was once human, what was once Evelyn, is now an eternal part of the void, an endless expanse where time loops upon itself, where the souls of the lost swirl in an eternal dance, forever forgotten. And yet in that dance, there is no hope, no redemption, only the suffocating pull of oblivion. The darkness calls to you now, just as it called to her. It whispers, soft and insistent, its voice like the rustling of dry leaves in a forgotten cemetery. It waits for you, just as it waited for Evelyn. Perhaps you hear it already, in the silence of your own mind, the subtle hum that vibrates beneath the skin, the cold breath that brushes the back of your neck, the creeping shadow that lurks just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to slip in. You can feel it, can't you? But you're not ready. Not yet. The entity is patient. It will wait. It has all the time in the world. And when you finally turn, when you finally listen, when you are ready, the darkness will be there, waiting for you. Just as it was for Evelyn. The entity does not need to destroy. It does not need to consume. It simply is. And when you understand that, when you finally surrender to the truth, that you are already a part of it, that you always have been, you will join Evelyn and countless others in that endless empty silence. You will become one with the void, and together, in that timeless darkness, you will exist forever. But for now, the silence remains. The end. This conclusion brings the story full circle, offering a chilling sense of inevitability. It suggests that the entity's influence extends beyond the confines of the story itself, leaving readers with a lingering sense of dread and foreboding. It's the perfect close for a tale of cosmic horror, where the fate of Evelyn, and perhaps the reader, seems sealed in an unending, eternal cycle.